overly circumscribed by the White House. Our Republican friends blame us for this process. They're always finding a straw man, but nothing could be further from the truth. First, they blame us for delay, knowing full well that Majority Leader McConnell has complete control of when nominees are brought to the floor. Leader McConnell could have moved this nominee 2 weeks ago or 1 week ago. Democrats had no say, and don't, when it comes to who comes to the floor. But in each case, Leader McConnell couldn't move the nominee forward because he was blocked by fellow Republicans, not Democrats, from moving forward. When it comes to complaining about delay, 2 words never come from our Republican friends' lips: Merrick Garland. Republicans are also saying we engaged in, quote, a smear campaign or the politics of personal destruction with this nomination. In reality, again, they're using Democrats as a straw man, because what they're really talking about is what Dr. Ford said. Democrats did not induce her to come forward. Her conscience did. And our Republican friends, are our Republican friends accusing Dr. Ford and her deeply held memories of what happened to her of a smear campaign? Are they accusing Dr. Ford of a smear campaign? Of engaging in the politics of personal destruction? Because that is who they're actually blaming. They're decrying her testimony and then trying to blame Democrats. I don't blame them. They have a flawed nominee. They don't want the focus on the nominee. When future Americans look back at these proceedings, let them draw no lessons from the Senate's conduct here. Let them look back on this chapter as the shameful culmination of the scorched earth politics practiced by the hard right in America. People who will stop at nothing to entrench an advantage on our nation's courts. Let the confirmation process for Judge Kavanaugh be recorded as a sorry epilogue to the brazen theft of Justice Scalia's seat, the ignominious end of bipartisan cooperation and consultation on the confirmation of Supreme Court justices. And for what? For whom were Senate Republican leaders willing to discard all semblance of fairness to confirm? Judge Brett Kavanaugh, certainly a product of an elite education, but also someone with hard right, conservative jurisprudence, far, far away from what average Americans believe. Why most Democrats opposed his nomination at the outset feels like ancient history now. But let us not forget that, most importantly, we strongly disagree with a number of Judge Kavanaugh's views. He's deeply skeptical of unenumerated rights, including a woman's right to make fundamentally private decisions about her medical care. He's deeply skeptical of the government's role in protecting Americans with pre-existing conditions. He's deeply skeptical of nearly all rules and regulations that protect consumers, workers, the environment. And the flashing red light warning sign at the center of Judge Kavanaugh's jurisprudence are his views on executive power and accountability. Somehow, this conservative judge and scholar of the Constitution sees at the heart of American democracy a president cum king, an executive who's unaccountable to the laws he's sworn to uphold, a head of state who, while in office, should be beyond the reach of subpoenas, criminal investigations, or civil investigations. This moment in American history demands deep skepticism about Judge Kavanaugh's views on executive power, nominated as he was by an executive who disdains the constraints of his office and who is at this very moment the apparent subject of investigations his Supreme Court nominee believes should be invalid. I met with Judge Kavanaugh for almost 2 hours, and I asked him about all of those issues. His answers were constantly evasive and utterly unsatisfactory. It was deja vu all over again in the first round of hearings, when Judge Kavanaugh deliberately avoided talking about his views on Roe, health care, presidential accountability, and more. There was no legal reason, rule, or logic that prevented him from being clear and saying what he thought. He was evasive because he knows that his views are deeply at odds with the progress America has made over the last century of jurisprudence, and at odds with what most Americans believe. His performance was not only unfair and frustrating to the Senate, it was unfair to the American people. When a nominee refuses to disclose their views, chances are you have a nominee whose views are far outside the mainstream of America, whether they be far right or far left. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle may not have as grave a concern about these views as we do, but let no American be surprised if Judge Kavanaugh becomes a decisive vote to restrict the rights and privileges of the American people while stretching the bounds of privilege for the current occupant of the White House. Judge Kavanaugh's nomination ultimately does not only encompass questions of ideology or credentials, but questions of character. Here again, Judge Kavanaugh falls woefully short of what Americans expect and deserve in a Supreme Court justice. He has repeatedly misled the Senate about his involvement in some of the most serious controversies of the Bush administration, including warrantless wiretapping of American citizens, our policy against torture, the theft of electronic records from Democratic senators, and his involvement in the nomination of very controversial judges. Faced with credible allegations of various types of misconduct, Judge Kavanaugh's credibility was again tested, and he continued to dissemble and even prevaricate about easily refuted facts. Beyond the issue of credibility, Judge Kavanaugh presented to the Senate the bitterest partisan testimony I have ever heard coming from a candidate seeking the Senate's approval, whether they be for the bench or the executive branch. Now, there are many who think that what happened when Judge Kavanaugh was 17 years old should not be dispositive. Even if you believe that, his actions at age 53, in terms of demeanor, partisanship, and above all, credibility, should be dispositive. Judges at every level of the federal bench should be held to the highest standard of ethics and moral character. Judges at every level should be judicious and credible and independent, but especially on the Supreme Court. I do not see how it's possible for my colleagues to say with perfect confidence that Judge Kavanaugh has the temperament, independence, and credibility to serve on the United States Supreme Court. So, I ask my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, why Judge Kavanaugh? There is no dictate that you have to march blindly forward with a nominee when there are others available to you. There are many judges who I'm sure conservatives would be happy to have on the court. I'd remind my colleagues, the seat that Brett Kavanaugh aspires to fill was held by a justice who assumed the bench after one nominee was voted down by the Senate and a second nominee withdrew his nomination. But the Republican majority has pressed forward blindly on Judge Kavanaugh, even when brave women came forward to speak truth to power. Why? For what cause? For the sake of winning? That's not reason enough. My colleagues on the other side If you have doubts about Judge Kavanaugh's credibility, about his ability to tell the truth, about his ability to be impartial and nonpartisan, no matter what you think of his jurisprudence or what he may or may not have done in high school and college, you should not vote to confirm him to the Supreme Court. So, my friends, Democrat and Republican, for all the controversy, all the heavy-handedness of the process, all the hyperbole and vilification of both sides, there's always hope that the Senate can save itself. We can salvage some decency here at the end. If Judge Kavanaugh is rejected, President Trump will select another nominee, likely right of center, probably not to my liking, but without the cloud that hangs over this nominee. And we can proceed to consider that nominee in a much less bitter, much better, less partisan way. A bipartisan majority of senators, considering fully the weight of Judge Kavanaugh's testimony, record, credibility, trustworthiness, and temperament, considering fully the heartbreaking testimony of Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, can vote to reject Judge Kavanaugh's nomination and ask the President to send the Senate another name. For the sake of the Senate, of the Supreme Court, and of America, I hope, I pray, my colleagues will do so.
All right. Yeah.
We've just been listening to Chuck Schumer on the Senate floor. Before him, Dianne Feinstein, and then before that, Chuck Grassley. Senators reiterating their arguments that we've been hearing out in the hallway, in scrums with journalists about Brett Kavanaugh. But I think what's kind of interesting for me is they're also sort of going back. If we could go back to the Wayback Machine, Vlad.
President Trump.
Or maybe we won't. Maybe we'll listen to what Mitch McConnell has to say.
Yes. Although, yeah.
On the Supreme Court. Judge Kavanaugh is a nominee of the very highest caliber, a brilliant legal mind, an accomplished jurist with a proven devotion to the rule of law. Today, the Senate has the opportunity to advance his nomination. Every one of us will go on record with one of the most consequential votes you ever cast in the Senate. Now, the stakes are always high for a Supreme Court nomination, but colleagues, the extraordinary events of recent weeks have raised them even higher this time. When we vote later this morning, we will not only be deciding whether to elevate a stunningly well-qualified judge to our highest court. Not anymore, not after all this. The United States Senate will also be making a statement. We'll either state that partisan politics can override the presumption of innocence, or we'll reaffirm that in the United States of America, everyone is innocent until proven guilty. We'll either state that facts and evidence can simply be brushed aside when politically inconvenient, and signal that media bullying and mob intimidation are valid tactics for shaping the Senate. The mob can attack, and the Senate caves. Or we'll stand up and say that serious, thoughtful, fact-based deliberation will still define this body. We'll either give notice that totally uncorroborated allegations are now officially enough to destroy an American's life, or we'll declare that our society cannot, must not, will not set the bar so low. So, Madam President, today is a pivotal day in the nomination process of this excellent judge. but it's a pivotal day for us here in the Senate as well. The ideals of justice that have served our nation so well for so long are on full display. So let's step back and sample a few of the choice moments that the Senate and the American people have been treated to during the disgraceful, absolutely disgraceful spectacle of the last 2 weeks. The very night Judge Kavanaugh was announced as the president's choice, we heard the junior senator from Oregon declare that this nominee would pave the way to tyranny. His audience? Crowds of far-left protesters still filling in the blanks on their picket signs. They weren't quite sure who the nominee was going to be yet. We've heard the junior senator from New Jersey describe Judge Kavanaugh's nomination as a great moral struggle in which there are just two camps. You're either complicit in the evil or you're fighting against it. More recently, we've heard the junior senator from Hawaii argue that her personal disagreement with Judge Kavanaugh's judicial philosophy meant, now listen to this, he deserved less of a presumption of innocence when it came to allegations of misconduct. If you disagree with her, you're not entitled to the presumption of innocence when it comes to allegations of misconduct. That's from a member of the Judiciary Committee? That's the definition of due process? Apparently you get due process only if you agree with her. And even more recently, we saw the junior senator from Rhode Island hold forth with great confidence, offering his expert interpretations of goofy jokes in high school yearbooks from the early 1980s. That was incredibly enlightening. Innocent jokes? Beer drinking references? Oh, no. Our colleague was quite positive there must be some other hidden or sinister meanings at play. Until, of course, a number of Judge Kavanaugh's classmates set him straight earlier this week. So stop and consider these snapshots. The absurdity, the indignity. This is our approach to confirming a Supreme Court justice. This is the Senate's contribution to public discourse. Before the ink had dried on Justice Kennedy's retirement, our Democratic colleagues made it perfectly clear what this process would be about: delay, obstruct, and resist. And before the ink had dried on Judge Kavanaugh's nomination, colleagues across the aisle, including Democratic members of the Judiciary Committee, were racing to announce they had made up their minds and were totally opposed to his confirmation. Mere hours after Judge Kavanaugh was nominated, my friend, the Democratic leader, promised, quote, "I will oppose him with everything I've got," he said, hours after he was nominated. It was thus abundantly clear that his number one political goal was to defeat the nomination by any means necessary. It was right there from the beginning, Madam President. A clear declaration, plain as day, nothing could get most Democrats to consider this nominee with an open mind. It would be delaying tactics, obstruction, and so-called resistance until the final vote was called. For a few weeks, their efforts played out along lines that sadly have become somewhat ordinary around here. There were excuses for delay. Those fell flat. There were gross distortions of Judge Kavanaugh's record that were batted down by outside fact checkers. And there were all the usual phony apocalyptic pronouncements that are shouted whenever a Republican president dares to nominate a Supreme Court justice. Happened every time. Hostile to women, hostile to vulnerable people, hostile to workers. Same old tricks, same old playbook. But here was the problem. The old plays weren't working. The distortions were being literally drowned out by the facts. Senators received and reviewed more pages of background materials on Judge Kavanaugh's nomination than for every previous Supreme Court nomination combined. We read Judge Kavanaugh's 12-year record of judicial rulings from our nation's second highest court, 300-plus opinions. We heard sworn testimony, written accounts from hundreds of character witnesses from all stages of Judge Kavanaugh's life and career. And the picture painted by these facts was nothing like the caricature. Nothing like the caricature. So it was clear, Madam President, the old tactics weren't working. Wasn't going to get the job done. The resistance demanded more. Try something new, they said. Well, we all know what happened next. Uncorroborated allegations of the most sensitive, most serious sort were quickly sharpened into political weapons. One such allegation, shared by Dr. Ford in confidence with the Democratic side of the Judiciary Committee, somehow, mysteriously, found its way into the press. Well, Chairman Grassley immediately set out on a sober, focused search for the truth. The committee collected testimony, organized a new hearing, and most recently asked for the supplemental FBI background investigation, Judge Kavanaugh's seventh FBI investigation. By any fair standard, the facts, the actual facts, proved to be straightforward. No corroborating evidence, none, was produced to support any of the allegations leveled against Judge Kavanaugh. No corroborating evidence from the FBI inquiry or from anywhere else. Nothing. Well, that wasn't enough for our Democratic colleagues, of course. The facts were not exactly the point. After all, we sort of get it by now. When the very FBI investigation for which they'd been clamoring turned up no new evidence, the Democrats moved the goalposts yet again. I believe the latest story is that the whole investigation is invalid. Now listen to this, because individuals who had only recently been told secondhand or thirdhand about nearly 40-year-old allegations weren't treated as essential witnesses. Let me say that again. The latest story is that the whole investigation is invalid because individuals who had only recently been told secondhand or thirdhand about nearly 40-year-old allegations weren't treated as essential witnesses. Never mind that they didn't actually witness anything. They didn't witness anything. So let's be clear, Madam President, these are not witnesses. These are people supposedly in possession of hearsay that they first heard 35 years after the supposed fact. What nonsense. The people whom Dr. Ford claimed were witnesses, they have spoken with the FBI. We know that because they, through their attorneys, put out public statements saying so. And what we know now is what we knew at this time a week ago. There is absolutely no corroborating evidence for these allegations. Same thing we heard a week ago. If they were, you bet we'd have heard about it, but there isn't. So notwithstanding that, Madam President, the leak of Dr. Ford's letter in violation of her privacy and against her wishes opened the floodgates. The feeding frenzy was full on. The weaponization of her letter by the left led to a torrent of other equally uncorroborated allegations. They were dumped on Judge Kavanaugh and his family. And breathlessly, the media seized on them. The more outlandish, the better. Americans were informed that Judge Kavanaugh masterminded violent drug gangs as a young teenager until that accuser walked her story back. We were informed that Judge Kavanaugh beat someone up on a boat in a Rhode Island harbor until that accuser totally recanted. We heard another tall tale of physical assault until that account was thoroughly debunked by a sitting federal judge. Oh, and yes, we were informed that juvenile jokes in his high school yearbook were actually sinister, secret references. All the Keystone cops were on the case. Keystone cops were on the case, Madam President. And Senate Democrats cheered them on. They read parts of this uncorroborated, unbelievable mudslide into the Senate record. They cited them in an official letter demanding that Judge Kavanaugh's nomination be withdrawn. Were they true? Well, of course, that was quite beside the point. Quite beside the point. So long as they were convenient. Every effort was made to ensure that the fact-free verdict of the mob and the media would win out over the actual evidence. Make sure the mob prevails. But the uncorroborated mud and the partisan noise and the physical intimidation of members here in the Senate will not have the final say around here. The Senate will have the final say. So, Madam President, we're almost at the end of the runway. The crosswinds of anger and fear and partisanship have blown strong these past weeks. They've harmed a good man and his family. They've tarnished the dignity of this institution. But all of it can end today. The time has come to vote. The Senate stands on the threshold of a golden opportunity. We have the opportunity to advance the nomination of an incredibly well-qualified and well-respected jurist to a post that demands such excellence. We have the opportunity to put Judge Brett Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court, where his distinguished service will make us and our nation proud for years to come. But we have the opportunity to do even more. Today, we can send a message to the American people that some core principles remain unfettered by the partisan passions of this moment. Facts matter. Fairness matters. The presumption of innocence is sacrosanct. The Senate has turned its back on these things before, Madam President, but never for long, and never without deep regret. This institution does not look back proudly on the era of Joseph McCarthy, nor on any of the other times when the politics of personal destruction poisoned its judgment. No, the Senate looks back on those things with shame and with a conviction that we cannot go down that road again. We know the Senate is better than this. We know the nation deserves better than this. By confirming Judge Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court, this brilliant jurist will be charged with upholding the rule of law and honoring American justice. We must hold ourselves to that very same standard. We must seize the golden opportunity before us today to confirm a Supreme Court justice who will make us proud, and to reaffirm our own commitment to the justice that every single American deserves.
As a reminder to our guests in the galleries, expressions of approval or disapproval are not permitted in the Senate galleries. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Brett M. Kavanaugh to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, signed by 17 senators.
Unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call be waived.
Is there an objection? Without an objection. By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Brett M. Kavanaugh of Maryland to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Aye.
Ms. Baldwin.
No.
Mr. Barrasso.
Aye.
Mr. Bennett.
No.
Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Mr. Donnelly. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller.
All right, you are listening to Democracy in Action here. United States senators all voting on cloture in the United States Senate. We have some sound. All right, let's take you back to this.
Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Kyle. Mr. Lankford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Smith.
All right, so just to give you an idea of what we're listening to right now, this is not a vote on Brett Kavanaugh. This is the vote to vote, essentially, right? Do we want to move to cloture? And what's very interesting is, of course, we're trying to listen to what certain key senators have to say, whether or not they think this process should move forward, because the indication is if they think the process should move forward, then they're in support of Brett Kavanaugh. Caitlin Huey-Burns is here right now with us. We've been trying to listen to how the senators are voting, and what we've discovered is some senators have chosen not to say anything at all.
Right, and remember how we've talked about earlier this week about how no senator really wants to be the only one voting yes or no. Nobody wants to be that defining vote. So we are listening really carefully to try to hear some of these folks. Remember, we're keeping an eye on Murkowski, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, and Joe Manchin of West Virginia, because those are the two senators who have been holding their cards so close to the vest.
And we're not sure if Murkowski, somebody said she didn't cast a vote, but I'm seeing on Twitter.
Right, and we're hearing from reporters in the room who they're trying to, some have said that she said no quietly. We're still trying to kind of figure out what exactly that was. That's significant.
Yes.
To say the least. And again, we're talking about a cloture vote, and just to help our audience again understand what this is voting to advance the bill. So if you're voting no here, that's pretty indicative. Now, there could be some, like Collins, Susan Collins of Maine, who did vote yes to advance the bill forward. But she has also said she'll make her final decision to the public at 3 p.m. today. So that gives an indication of sometimes people will vote to advance something and then vote against it later. That's very, very rare.
Okay.
But in this day and age, I should say.
Right.
So it is significant, given all of that Murkowski, if in fact it was a clear no, that would be one less.
Yeah.
So
saying no over and over again.
538.com. The Nate Silver blog has something I think is interesting to share with our viewers. The percentage of which these senators who are on the bubble vote with President Trump's preferences. Senator Ben Sasse, 87% of the time. Senator Jeff Flake, 84% of the time. Lisa Murkowski, 83% of the time. Susan Collins of Maine, 80%. Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, who's a Democrat, 61%, and Senator Heidi Heitkamp, 56%. That is kind of interesting.
And that's why we're focused on Manchin. Remember, he's up for re-election in just a month from a state that is getting as red as it could possibly get. It's a state that Trump won overwhelmingly. It's a state that Trump is so popular that the Republican candidate running against Manchin is really just running as an ally of Trump, hoping that he can absorb, and everything that Trump can give there. So that's why we're focused so closely on Manchin, because he has crossed the aisle before to vote for some of these nominees. He voted for Neil Gorsuch. He voted for a few other appointments by the president for executive positions. So that is why we're very focused on him, especially since Murkowski voting no, that means that they need another vote. Now, Mike Pence, of course, we know Mike Pence is staying in Washington this weekend to perhaps be that tiebreaker if needed. So if Murkowski is a no, I'm wondering what that means for Manchin. There are two ways to look at it. First, you could say Manchin could be the replacement vote, or someone like Murkowski could be giving cover to Manchin, and so he can go home and say, if in fact he votes against this, he can go home and say, well, I wasn't the only one.
How much is this about Brett Kavanaugh as opposed to about taking the temperature back home in their home states and figuring out whether they're going to have to pay the price for the way they vote?
Right. Well, I was talking to Manchin's office yesterday, and they said that their phone lines are just overloaded. They've been getting tons and tons of calls. I asked kind of who they're coming from, said all over the spectrum, but kind of divided. And yesterday he was meeting with victims of sexual assault in his office, as was Murkowski. So remember, all this lobbying going on behind the scenes and this last-minute effort to change some minds.
Ricky Kleeman, our legal analyst, is joining us on the phone. Ricky, what's your take on what we're seeing playing out on the floor of the United States Senate?
Well, I think that what we're really looking at is how have these people also reacted to Judge Kavanaugh's op-ed, where he was apologetic about his behavior during the hearing. I think that gives the senators who are on the fence a lot of cover. But what we are really going to look and see is exactly where you just were, is Joe Manchin. I have met Joe Manchin in the past. My husband has certainly known him in the past. He is a person of great conscience, and this has to be a very difficult decision for him. Does he stay with his party, or does he go with his state? What is his role? Is his role as a senator, Democrat or Republican, to represent the will of the people of the state he represents? The will of the people as a red state will want to confirm Kavanaugh despite the fact that he is a Democrat. I think he is in the most challenging position of all.
He is in a really difficult position, and I was talking to a Republican strategist who's been involved in a lot of these Senate campaigns, and he said that if Manchin votes for Kavanaugh, then the race is kind of in his favor. If he votes against him, he thinks the race is over. So, you know, this Joe Manchin has kind of carved out, as Ricky said, an identity for himself in West Virginia, but we are in a time now where politics has become very tribal. Joe Manchin is the last Democrat standing in West Virginia from a federal and local level in terms of public office. So, you know, him voting yes on this is important. And also, if he does, in fact, continue to vote yes on the final vote, that gives Kavanaugh some bipartisan confirmation.
It does appear
by a thread.
By a very, very thin
well,
thread.
so again, we're trying to listen to the vote on the floor. We have reporters that are obviously on the floor of the Senate, and it does look like Senator Murkowski, as we said earlier, voted no on the procedural vote to advance Judge Kavanaugh. But Senators Flake, Manchin, and Collins. Again, this is preliminary as we can we confirm that Senators Flake, Manchin, and Collins control room voted yes?
Okay, so they're looking into that. So these are sort of.
I also want to remind you
Flake
that
and Collins.
just because someone votes yes or no on the procedural vote does not mean that that's their vote finally. The great example is John McCain dealing with the health care bill. He voted yes on the cloture vote, and then he voted no ultimately on the health care bill.
All right, Ricky Kleeman, I know you're getting on a flight. We thank you for calling in. As always, we appreciate it.
Okay.
Thanks, Ricky. All right, so as we try to nail down how these folks have voted, obviously, as we've been sort of saying to our audience, this is not the vote. This is just the vote for cloture. But it does historically give some insight into how some of these senators might possibly vote tomorrow, if this happens tomorrow.
That's right, and that's why Murkowski is really significant here, because she voted no to advance the bill.
So Manchin just confirmed. We can say that Senators Flake, Manchin, and Collins voted yes. Senator Murkowski voted no on this procedural vote.
And let's talk about Murkowski for a minute, because there are a couple different things going on with her. Yes, she is considered a more moderate Republican. She's often a swing vote on a few things. She has talked about this vote beyond Brett Kavanaugh. She's engaged in conversations about the Me Too movement, about what this means in terms of believing women who come forward with accusations. She's kind of engaged that debate. Second, the governor of her state opposes Brett Kavanaugh, and there is a lot of resistance to Kavanaugh among Native Americans in the state who believe that some of his rulings on tribal issues are very problematic. So she's got some competing parts here, but her voting no to advance the bill likely means she's voting no on final passage.
What is the strategy behind, for example, Susan Collins voting to proceed and then saying to the world, to the public, that she'll announce her final vote at 3 p.m. today? I mean, what's the strategy behind that?
Right. So traditionally, a vote for cloture is a vote to open up the bill for debate on the floor. Just given how our politics is now, people usually vote the same way on cloture and on final passage. But I'm wondering if either Susan Collins is just voting to open up the debate and wants to, take time to start to explain what she's going to do. At 3 p.m., of course, it's been reported that she is going to explain what her final vote will be. That could she could come out and say that this is the reason why I'm voting for him, and I want to have the opportunity to say that to everybody, or it could be something else here.
Is it because she is still, and I know we're asking to like speculate on what she's thinking, but is she really still on the fence?
Well, what's really interesting to consider about Collins compared to someone like Murkowski is that Collins has talked very favorably of Kavanaugh in the past. Remember, Roe v. Wade has been a key sticking point for almost all of the Democrats, but especially some of these more moderate Republicans like Collins and Murkowski. And Collins has said, after meeting with Judge Kavanaugh before these allegations came out, that she was confident that he wouldn't vote to overturn Roe v. Wade, and she was confident in his experience. And so she has been looking, if you take her public statements and the way she's been approaching it, a lot of these senators want to vote yes on a judicial nominee, a Supreme Court nominee. For Republicans, this is an organizing principle in terms of elections, in terms of this is something that's just really been traditionally critical for Republicans, something that they see this opportunity to shape the courts just a little bit differently than Democrats have. Now, that might change in the midterm elections, but Collins has been talking in ways that suggest she wants to get to yes. So the FBI report came out yesterday. There's an argument that gave political cover for some of these folks.
So here is the breakdown of how the senators have voted. The nomination advances to the final floor vote because you can see the yeas have it 51, the nays 49. The nomination will advance to a final floor vote, which we expect, Caitlin, according to Leader McConnell, sometime tomorrow.
Sometime tomorrow. And remember, last night we were getting reports that Steve Daines, a Republican from Montana, needs to be back in Montana tomorrow to walk his daughter down the aisle. He said that is, he needs to do that and will do that. So that kind of expressed to us yesterday that there was some confidence that they had the votes that they needed.
I want to flag a tweet from Susan Page, who is frequently on our air at CBS News, who's the USA Today Washington bureau chief. She put something interesting on Twitter, and I'm going to quote her here. One consequence of Manchin voting yes and Murkowski voting no on cloture, assuming that previews their ultimate vote, is that Brett Kavanaugh won't be the first Supreme Court justice confirmed strictly along party lines. That's kind of interesting in terms of a strategy, which is that, there seems to be a consensus in this country from people who are not in the Senate or who are not lawmakers that this is going to come down to party lines, and it may ultimately not be that.
By a razor thin.
That's the thing about
razor
it.
Thin.
But what's interesting is that Supreme Court nominees used to be traditionally bipartisan.
Yeah.
Remember last week you heard Lindsey Graham saying, I voted for Elena Kagan.
And Sotomayor.
And Sotomayor. And, traditionally it is thought that the president has the power and the party in power, to confirm a nominee for the Supreme Court. This has been changing.
And you heard some of the senators before the vote try to remind us of what sort of the beginning of this process was all about. Try to remind us that the debate was supposed to be about his fitness as a judge, his record, his legal experience, and clearly they differ on whether they got enough information. Remember when the big controversy was documents from when he worked for the Bush administration and whether thousands or hundreds of thousands were released? That seems like, several months ago maybe that happened. What are you guys listening to? Because I can see everyone's face kind of looking around.
No, because I think we'll repeat that in the control room. All right, Molly Hooper is joining us now on the phone to talk about this. This is democracy in action. No matter how you feel about it and where you're leaning or which way the wind is blowing in your home or in your district, this is what democracy looks like. Molly, what's your take on what we just witnessed here?
This is what democracy looks like, exactly. That's one of the chants that I've heard many times out in front of the Supreme Court regarding this issue, regarding a lot of other issues. But yes, this is what democracy looks like. And what they voted on today was simply to move on to a final vote on the confirmation. And just because Susan Collins voted for this doesn't necessarily mean she'll vote for confirmation, and she probably will. But again, this was a procedural vote technically. So the fact that Manchin voted for it was pretty big. He's a Democrat, and traditionally, when you're voting on a procedural vote like this, you don't necessarily cross party lines. It's something that happens in the House on so-called rule votes. In fact, the people in power, when Republicans vote against a rule in the House and they vote against a procedural rule like this in the Senate, that's almost more upsetting to the leadership than the final vote, because ultimately what the leaders want is a vote on confirmation, regardless of whether it's up or down. Get a vote on the confirmation. And what happened today was simply moving on to that final vote.
So, Molly, do you buy this idea that because he got at least one Democratic vote, that perhaps he can go down in history? He'll be remembered as at least, a Supreme Court justice that the votes were not along party lines? Or with the way I personally feel the way the larger debate has been going, it's going to seem like a very partisan decision.
I think it will, and the reason I say that is because when you look at the previous Supreme Court justices, barring over the past few administrations, including Sotomayor, including Elena Kagan, it was very partisan. When you look back at prior, up till about Clarence Thomas, the votes for a Supreme Court justice were essentially 99-0, 98-0. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, 97-0. I mean, it was pretty much unanimous. And that's, this advise and consent rule. But when you started to get to Clarence Thomas and justices following Clarence Thomas, the party line started breaking down, and the closer that vote gets, the more partisan it gets. So yes, it's hard to say that he will be remembered as a bipartisan, as a figure who was voted on in a bipartisan basis because of one Democrat. It's more important that he was confirmed, regardless.
Hey Molly, it's Caitlin. What's really interesting to me is that Susan Collins, of course, voted yes on cloture, but she's also said later today that she is going to announce her decision on final passage at 3 p.m. What are you hearing? Do you expect that she will continue this vote, or does she change her mind? What is your sense?
Well, again, I mean, Susan Collins is one of those senators who's still going back and looking at these documents, is still considering, what she's seeing. And as I said earlier, the reason why I brought up the point about the procedural matter is because when you vote against cloture, i.e. moving on to debate of a certain measure, that's something the leadership really does look at in terms of whether you're going to get what committee assignments you get next Congress, what chairmanships you get, things like that. Like Murkowski voting no to move on to a final vote, that could hurt her in terms of her role in the Senate, in terms of her chairmanship of the Environment and Natural Resources Committee, or her seniority on certain committees. So again, even though Collins did vote for cloture, I do believe that she's still trying to figure out whether she's going to vote yes or no. And I wouldn't necessarily. Yeah.
Sorry, Molly, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I was just going to say in response to what you're suggesting there, which is that it is interesting that Murkowski votes no, because we've heard all along that she has a very significant number of constituents who are against Judge Kavanaugh. Caitlin pointed out earlier the governor of her state is not supportive of Judge Kavanaugh. On the other hand, you've got Joe Manchin, who's facing a very, very tough re-election battle in West Virginia, and he's voted yes. Now, we don't know what his final vote will be, but I'm just curious, in this case, does it feel like Murkowski and Manchin are listening to their constituents, or are we to be more cynical about it and say, look, Joe Manchin's in a very red state that Donald Trump won significantly, and he's facing this tough re-election battle, and he wants to be reelected, and so he knows that is where his bread is buttered?
Well, I think you could say that for both of them. I mean, think about it. I mean, democracy, this is what democracy looks like. Each senator, pardon me, I have sort of a grovelly voice this morning. Each senator is elected by constituents in their state, and if their state doesn't want them to vote a certain way, and the senator ends up voting the opposite, they might get, ousted. I mean, you have people in your state who want you to vote a certain way, and if you don't vote that way, then they'll elect somebody else. And so yeah, I think that both senators are listening to the people in their state. And going to Caitlin's point, the Native Alaskan population is a huge constituency of Murkowski. When Murkowski ran as a write-in candidate, I believe that was in 2010 or earlier against Joe Miller, who actually won the Republican nomination at the time. A large base of her support was the Native Alaskan population, and they are against Brett Kavanaugh. And that was, during the hearing, one thing that kind of struck me was when Mazie Hirono didn't necessarily bring up the sexual misconduct allegations, but brought up Brett Kavanaugh's emails and writings regarding the Native Hawaiian population, which could indicate how he feels about self-governance for Native populations in general. It was pointed clearly at Lisa Murkowski, because Lisa Murkowski, answers to her Native Alaskan population, and they will be the ones who get out and vote for her come next election. So yes, I think she is listening to her constituents.
And
it's a big deal for her.
I think, just going off of that, what's really interesting about this particular fight, Molly mentioned that traditionally Supreme Court justices do enjoy a bipartisan vote. Even Neil Gorsuch, remember, got 3 Democrats in the form of Manchin, Heitkamp, and Donnelly, and that's why we were watching those votes. Very different today, except for Manchin. We have to also consider that the president has been framing this in strictly political terms. Remember, he's been on the campaign trail all week, visiting deep red states where he is very popular, and the feedback he has been getting and what he has been telling his supporters is that a vote against Judge Kavanaugh is a vote against Trump and the administration and the agenda and what you, the Trump voter, have supported. And that has been something that has galvanized Republicans. And the Supreme Court battle has the potential, we saw it in 2016 and we're seeing it now, to coalesce the Republican Party around Donald Trump, even after they view many things that he's done as unfavorable or they take issue with his rhetoric. The Supreme Court fights, the judicial nominations across the country are so important to them, and the president has seized on that. Now, you can argue that can they sustain that for the next month or so? But as we're talking about this point in time on this particular vote, it is clear that Republicans have been united, with the exception of Murkowski, around this nominee.
I think what we've seen with the president, at least at some of his rallies, is he's sort of got a narrative that he's pushing now that even if they get the Supreme Court justice that they want, you should still be angry because they should have never put this good man through something like this. Paula Reed standing by. Paula, we're hearing a little bit from the White House now about how they feel about how things are going. What can you tell us?
That's right. White House officials here tell me they are confident following this procedural vote that they will be able to get enough votes to confirm Judge Kavanaugh, but they're not taking anything for granted. We are told that they are still pursuing even some Democratic senators. For example, Joe Donnelly of Indiana, even though he said he may vote no, they're still pursuing him. They're trying to flip anyone they can. They're working the phones, trying to pressure anyone to get Judge Kavanaugh across the finish line. Now, we are also told that the White House believes that Democratic Senator Joe Manchin will end up ultimately voting for Judge Kavanaugh. He was asked about this a short time ago. He said he was still undecided, but the White House right now, they remain cautiously optimistic and, in their words, confident.
We saw a tweet from the President of the United States, Paula. It says, very proud of the U.S. Senate for voting yes to advance the nomination of Judge Brett Kavanaugh. And it's something that Anne-Marie pointed out, which is the president has been very vocal. And it feels, I think, for a lot of people that this discussion around Judge Kavanaugh has moved beyond the original sexual misconduct allegations, the sexual harassment, assault allegation that Christine Blasey Ford and Deborah Ramirez made against Judge Kavanaugh. And it is now about, it's become a very political issue. It's become sort of a political football where the president is able to frame it almost as if Judge Kavanaugh is a martyr, and a martyr to men across this country who might, in the president's words, be falsely accused, much in the same way that he says has been falsely accused when it comes to himself and the dozens of women who have accused him of sexual misconduct.
Sure, and perhaps a symbolic martyr for the Trump administration. This has been a rallying call for Republican voters ahead of these critical midterms. The polling reflects that the Kavanaugh issue has really helped them close the enthusiasm gap that they were seeing. And the president, as you said, he has seized on this. On Wednesday, he tweeted, "Something very big is happening." He noted that there was more enthusiasm and energy for the upcoming midterms because of what many people perceive, the president and his allies, as an attack on Judge Kavanaugh. Their argument is, well, Democrats don't like that President Trump won the election. They don't like his agenda, so they're going to take it out on Judge Kavanaugh. He'll also allege that he's in cahoots with the press and that it's sort of a broad conspiracy against his agenda, and it's Judge Kavanaugh is the one who's being punished. So he has used this successfully. Just yesterday morning, he was talking about how unfairly he's tweeted how harsh and unfair the treatment of Judge Brett Kavanaugh has been. And he's also talking about how it's had an incredible, quote, upward impact on voters. So he is absolutely trying to seize on this controversy. And while this has not gone the way any Republicans would have expected or hoped, they're trying to see the upside that this could be what they need to help them in the midterms.
Paula, you talked about what the Republicans are up to now, trying to, at least if they can, turn some Democrats to try to get a larger margin. But I'm wondering if you're hearing anything about the Democrats. You have a little bit of reporting about Dianne Feinstein leaving the Senate chamber, saying that this was a mistake. And she was asked whether or not she was confident that Democrats could defeat Kavanaugh. And she said, "I don't know." So I imagine the Democrats are probably pretty busy as well behind the scenes right now.
Absolutely. And like I said, the White House is still working on some red state Democrats who have said they'll vote no, trying to push them. I mean, particularly when it comes to Joe Manchin. He doesn't want to be in a situation where he's the deciding vote. He doesn't want that sticking to him. And they think that they could be able to flip him and get him to vote yes. So absolutely, no one really knows how this is going to turn out over the next 24, or I guess specifically 30 hours we have until this vote. But right now, the White House, they are confident. They are working the phones. They're not taking anything for granted.
You know, Caitlin, I was thinking about this vote as it moves forward, and we've talked about the importance of getting a conservative justice, another conservative justice on the Supreme Court, particularly for some of the Trump supporters who might not typically support him, like evangelicals. And what I've been thinking, though, is that should Kavanaugh make it onto the Supreme Court, that would be two conservative justices on, then what motivation do evangelicals have to continue to support Donald Trump? I mean, they're getting what they want. And then there's, there's his personal, some of his behavior. It's not exactly Christian-like.
I spent last week talking to various evangelical leaders in various places across the country about Kavanaugh. And what I was hearing more often was it's not just about the Supreme Court, which is critically important to them. It's about two other things. First of all, judgeships across the country, which the Republican Senate has been key in shaping, and that's been a key item of interest for McConnell and what he wants his legacy to be. And second, what the president is doing from an administrative perspective on various regulations, religious freedom regulations, and things like that. They're very supportive of decisions that the president has made from an administration standpoint that they are still very supportive of. And then, of course, there's the potential for possibly another Supreme Court opening in the next 2 years, right? So they just kind of like what they're seeing is what I'm hearing from them. And it's critical because these are folks that have the power to galvanize people to turn out to vote. They've demonstrated it in 2016. They're still on his side. And I think the president is going to try to keep that up by saying, look what could happen if Democrats take over. Everything that you wanted and that you've worked for and that you fought for on this nomination could still be at stake. And so that's what I'm hearing that they want to hear from Donald Trump.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Paula, before we let you go, the president was in Minnesota yesterday, and there was a curious moment when he was speaking to his supporters at this rally where he brought up the name of Senator Al Franken, who, as you know, was essentially removed from the Senate. He resigned his position as a senator because of sexual misconduct allegations. And the president, it felt to me as if the president was sort of mocking Senator Franken, not because of the wrongdoing, but because he chose to back down. And as we know, in President Trump's world, you never do that.
Exactly, that's right. It wasn't really about the allegations, it was about how he handled them. He sort of folded, to use the president's term, and criticizing him for not doing what the president says is his traditional playbook whenever you're faced with these kinds of accusations, which is deny, 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 and fight, which is part of what explains some of Judge Kavanaugh's composure that we saw in that hearing. He's even now said, look, I was more emotional than I've ever been. But a lot of people saw that hearing as being for an audience of one. Really, he needed to prove to the president that he was willing to fight not only for his nomination, but for the president's legacy that is at stake with any sort of Supreme Court justice nominee. So it's not surprising that the president sort of took some jabs at somebody who took a different approach when faced with those kinds of accusations.
So you talked about the emotional presentation being for an audience of one. Let's talk about this op-ed then, where he sort of apologized for being very emotional for an audience of 100 or so.
The question is, yeah, I mean, there were reports, Paula, that the White House thought that this was sort of Brett Kavanaugh going off the reservation once again.
Many people see it as a closing argument for perhaps, I think we're at an audience of 4 critical votes right now. I think you sort of saw his testimony before Congress as an opening argument, as aggressive defense of himself, sort of defending himself, trying not only in the eyes of the president, but also trying to preserve his reputation. If this doesn't work out, he goes back to being a federal judge. We cannot imagine how difficult this has been, of course, on Dr. Ford, but also on Judge Kavanaugh and his family. So here you see him writing an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. It's very sober, sort of walking back how he handled it. Perhaps he watched SNL over the weekend and thought, oh my goodness, a lot of this wasn't made up by these writers. I actually said some of those things. But again, this is a closing argument, not necessarily before an audience of one. He seems to have passed the test of the president. This time it's before those 4 critical votes that could help him get confirmed to the highest court in the land.
I think what Paula said is so interesting about that he might actually, if this doesn't work out, he'd have to go back to his other job. And we know so much more now about his life. I mean, can you imagine bringing a case in front of him? How often will he hear, I think you might have to recuse yourself, sir, because of something that we learned about you in high school.
That's an argument that many are making right now based on his performance during that hearing. Paula Reed, you're at the White House for us, as always. We thank you. We'll talk to you in a little bit. Nancy Cordes is standing by on the Hill. Nancy, exciting moments here. And let's jump off before we talk about sort of the dynamics that we just witnessed on the floor of the Senate and what happens next. I do find it interesting. We were talking about this op-ed that Judge Kavanaugh wrote in the Wall Street Journal, and some interpreted that op-ed as a plea, or at least an attempt to speak to those senators who were appalled by his behavior during that judiciary hearing, including Senators Flake and perhaps even Senators Collins.
Sure, definitely a recognition on his part that perhaps he needed to do some damage control. Perhaps he needed to send a message that he understood that his temperament in that hearing, when he snapped at a few senators, when he described the allegations against him by these 2 women as part of some kind of a Democratic Clinton-led conspiracy, were perhaps not the type of comments that you would typically expect to come from someone who was looking to sit on the highest court in the land. And so he wrote that very carefully worded op-ed in which he didn't necessarily apologize for those comments, but he acknowledged them and said that perhaps some of the things that he said crossed the line, but it was all because he felt so strongly that he was being wrongly accused and that he was thinking about his family and how they must feel at this moment. Jeff Flake, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski have never come out directly and said that they have deep concerns about his temperament based on the way that he conducted himself in the hearing. In fact, Jeff Flake said that on 60 Minutes that, he might feel the same way if he felt that he had been wrongly accused, and he might also be angry, and that he understood where that passion came from. But this is someone who is thinking not just about getting confirmed, but also thinking about his reputation as he moves towards sitting on the Supreme Court, and how he will be viewed, how much trust people can place in his decisions, how much trust people can have in the fact that he is going to be an impartial jurist. And it seems like he had all of that in mind when he wrote that op-ed.
Nancy, it's Caitlin. We've been watching Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski for the past nearly 2 weeks now. both voted very differently today, obviously.
Right.
First of all, do you think that Collins has any chance of voting no on final passage? She said that she's going to make an announcement at 3 o'clock today. And then for Murkowski, can you talk a little bit about, what it's like for her and kind of what factored into her decision today, being the only Republican to vote no on cloture?
Well, I'll tell you, it was really fascinating watching the two of them in the Senate chamber. I was there in the chamber. They sit right next to each other. Their desks are right next to one another. And when Murkowski's name was called and she said no, she said it so softly that at first everyone sort of leaned over and said, wait, what did she say? And it was, it was then that we realized that she was voting no to advance this nomination. Even after she did that, Collins, who was sitting next to her, sort of leaned over from time to time, chatted with her as the rest of the senators were casting their votes. Murkowski was very straight-faced, sort of looking ahead, not registering much emotion. But right after the vote ended, this is what was so fascinating, is two Republicans came up to Murkowski right away. John Cornyn of Texas, Rob Portman of Ohio, two big supporters of Judge Kavanaugh. In fact, Rob Portman had been actively lobbying some of his colleagues on Kavanaugh's behalf. They came up to her and they shook her hand as if to say, no hard feelings. And then after they moved on, Maria Cantwell, a Democrat from Washington State, walked up, handed her a note, and walked away. Two other Democratic women, Amy Klobuchar and Tammy Baldwin, also came up, big smiles on their faces, to talk to her. And Susan Collins had her arm around Murkowski's shoulder. So what that says about how Susan Collins is going to vote in the end, I don't know, because she has kept us in such great suspense. But she was clearly sending a signal that she understands where Murkowski is in this debate, and certainly has been there at her side through so many of these tough votes, and was showing her support again today.
Nancy, I also note that in John Nolan, your producer's note to us, that when Senator Manchin voted yes on cloture, there was a slight gasp in the chamber when he voted. What's your take on that?
There was. Well, I think the sense was that if Lisa Murkowski was going to vote no, then perhaps Manchin would vote no as well. And he did a great job of keeping everyone in suspense. We had spoken to him just a short time before the vote, and he said he was still undecided. And we had been led to believe that his vote here just to advance the nomination would most likely mirror his vote tomorrow for confirmation. That's typically how he likes to handle these things, but we don't know for sure. That is another unknown. It's highly possible, you guys, in this sort of anything goes environment, that he decided, I'm still not sure what I want to do, so I'm going to go ahead and advance this nomination, and that'll buy me another 24 hours to decide exactly how I feel. I know his aides have two statements essentially written up for him, and they're just waiting to get the word from him on what he wants to do before they release one statement or the other. So he clearly, has gone back and forth and believes that there are very strong arguments to be made on both sides.
It's so fascinating.
So does that mean that, we will see Democrats like Dianne Feinstein picking up the phone, going to people's offices? I mean, is this really going to be coming down to the wire?
Well, when it comes to Joe Manchin, things are a little tricky for Democrats. As Dick Durbin put it this morning on CBS This Morning, the typical, putting the screws to someone, it doesn't quite work. In fact, Democrats have learned the hard way that if you put too much pressure on Joe Manchin, who has an independent streak, sometimes it can backfire, and he can get a little frustrated and go the other way. So they've taken a hands-off approach. They realize that he is really he is really weighing his options and sifting through both the political arguments, the arguments about the Supreme Court, the arguments about Kavanaugh himself, the arguments about this sexual assault allegation, and that it really won't do them much good to try to force him off the fence one way or the other, no matter how badly they would like to know at this point where he stands.
Yeah, and we can all remember that photograph snapped by our Capitol Hill producer from CBS News, Bo Erickson, that picture of Senator Feinstein with her arm there, sort of talking to Senator Murkowski, and wouldn't you like to know what was being said?
Right, and we all know how strongly Feinstein has felt throughout this process, calling it a mistake, this narrow 51-49 vote to advance the nomination. Obviously, she has been at the center of this storm, and there are still big questions about how this anonymous letter from Christine Blasey Ford made it into the public eye, and she hasn't really had very clear answers about that, aside from saying that she herself and her office didn't leak it. So, you know, these are women, I should point out, even though they are on opposite sides of the aisle, the women of the Senate meet routinely and talk among themselves, Democrats and Republicans. They work together, they take pride in working together, they take pride in showing the men how capable the two sides are of working together, even through difficult issues. And so Feinstein and Murkowski have a very long relationship where they probably feel that they can be pretty blunt with one another.
All right, Nancy Cordes, you're on the Hill for us, where we note, for our viewers who are watching, Senator John Cornyn, the majority whip, is making a speech, I'm sure, in staunch defense of Judge Kavanaugh. But it is interesting, Nancy, that the majority whip, whose job it is to whip those votes, walked over to Senator Murkowski to thank her. Nancy Cordes, thank you so much for your reporting. As always, we appreciate it. All right, we've still got Molly Hooper on the phone with us, I believe. And I don't know if we're going to listen to Senator Cornyn or keep discussing what we just witnessed about 15, 20 minutes ago. All right, so let's listen in to Senator Cornyn. Molly, we'll talk to you on the other side of that.
That somebody could be denied a confirmation based on an unproven allegation, I can't imagine people being willing to subject themselves to that in the future. And it would be a dark day for the Senate and for the United States and for our system of justice that believes in a fair process and a constitutional presumption of innocence. And when an allegation is made, that the person making that allegation actually has to come forward with some evidence. A number of senators, actually it was a bipartisan consensus, wanted the FBI to conduct a limited investigation into current credible allegations that were pending. They wanted the FBI to interview individuals like Mark Judge, who had already offered a sworn statement under penalty of felony, and others who may have had information that were identified by Dr. Ford as being present on the day that this alleged activity took place. There was no confirmation, there was no corroboration. In fact, there was a refutation. The people she said were there and could be witnesses, were witnesses to what happened, said, I have no knowledge of that. Dr. Ford's best friend, Leland Kaiser, said, I don't even know Brett Kavanaugh. I've never met him. Well, we've all had an opportunity to read the confidential report. We've seen who was interviewed, what they were asked, and any doubts that people may have had should now have been put to rest by what the contents reveal. These fantasies about Judge Kavanaugh being some sort of serial high school or college predator have been exposed as only that, myths, not based on fact. There's no reliable evidence whatsoever to support any of these baseless allegations against Judge Kavanaugh. But as we know, this wasn't exactly designed to be a truth-finding process. This wasn't a search for the truth. Our colleagues across the aisle had already made up their mind a long time ago, some even before Judge Kavanaugh had been nominated. This was more of a, as the majority leader said earlier today, not a search for the truth, but a search and destroy mission. And obviously, as they continue to move the goalposts, calling for more delays, more investigations, there's been 7 background investigations by the FBI of Judge Kavanaugh during his public service. The FBI has talked to more than 150 witnesses. Don't you think if there were anything to these outrageous allegations, that some of that would have come up at some point in the 7 FBI background investigations have been conducted. But our colleagues across the aisle continue to resist putting a definitive end to this process and, unfortunately, caring little, if any, about the reputation of somebody who has demonstrated his outstanding qualifications and his commitment to public service. I think some of these attacks have become exhausted, politically exhausted, frankly. Our colleagues don't seem to realize what they have unleashed. When senators get coat hangers mailed to their home, protesters, paid protesters, show up on their doorstep or at their office or are accosted in the halls of the United States Congress. Paid protesters who reportedly, once they get arrested, actually make more money from their funders than they do if they don't get arrested. That is what has been unleashed. Chairman Grassley called it mob rule. That's exactly right. Where the Judiciary Committee, during the first confirmation hearing for Judge Kavanaugh, where senators said, I'm breaking the rules. I'm releasing committee confidential information I know the rules prohibit me from doing. And they don't care. If there are no rules and there are no norms, and if we don't have enough respect for this institution and the people whose lives we touch, this is what gets unleashed. I feel badly for Dr. Ford in particular. She wanted none of this three-ring circus. She sent a letter to the ranking member and asked their identity remain confidential, only to find after the first confirmation hearing that it was leaked to the press. And then the press came to talk to her, and I guess she figured she had nothing else, no other recourse but to actually tell her story to the press once her wishes were violated. She didn't consent to that. She didn't authorize the release of that confidential letter to the press, but that's what happened.
All right, you're listening to the Majority Whip, Senator John Cornyn of Texas. He is making the case why he believes that Judge Brett Kavanaugh should be advanced to the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court of the United States. He should be made an associate justice. Now we're going to show you what is happening just outside of the Capitol, where you could see.
Well, now we have police officers, but there have been protesters up and down the hallway, and we've been told that some of those protesters are being arrested. You know, there have been protesters sort of throughout the building and through outside. The protesters taken to the streets yesterday, but particularly in the building where they can get closer to some of these senators. You know, it's made a difference. A part of the reason why this vote is happening now and hasn't already happened is because, you know, some demonstrators were able to talk to Senator Jeff Flake and convince him at least that, you know, an FBI, an additional probe by the FBI was warranted. And so they are clearly continuing to keep the pressure up as this process moves forward.
And you know, and Molly Hooper is
demonstrators walking
being
through,
arrested. Molly Hooper is joining us. She's a CBSN contributor. She writes for The Hill. Molly, you know, one of the things that I think it's interesting to keep all this in perspective, you know, as Anne-Marie points out, Senator Flake, if you want to believe his sentiments and the interviews that he gave to 60 Minutes with Senator Chris Coons, really was really moved by those women and those individuals who came to him and asked him to look into his heart, human to human, and make a decision based on the very real things that had happened to them, right? And then you see the opposite when you've got Senator Orrin Hatch, who's been in the Senate for over 25 years, who went through something similar like this with Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill, you know, sort of basically poo-pooing them.
He said he told them to grow up or something along those lines.
And I find it, you know, the perspective that I have about that is these United States senators are some of the most powerful people in the world. Many of them are millionaires many times over. They have an enormous platform. The only time they're ever going to hear how the people feel about decisions that they make in their name are when they interact with them at this level. And so for a senator to sort of like dismiss how people are feeling, I think it says a lot about why people on both sides of the aisle are angry with this Congress.
Well, sure, and for the people who do take the day off work, who who really have had something terrible happen in their life, and who are actually there to talk to a senator and have a conversation with them, that's exactly right. And I talked to Bob Corker about this, who is one of those Republican senators approached at the airport on Monday by a group of women who were doing it to, and men, who were doing it to other Republican senators and have been up here in the halls of Congress going into offices and whatnot and screaming at the senators. So Bob Corker says there's a difference between somebody walking across the hall saying, this happened to me, I really am opposed to this person, can you please consider that? Okay, and what they're getting with some of these protesters who are just bum rushing them and screaming in their face, not saying anything, and not listening or having a conversation. And I've been up here on Capitol Hill for quite a while, covered various high-profile issues, polarizing matters, and have seen protesters of all stripes. Heck, I went to Berkeley.
Enough said.
Go Bears, baby! But I got to tell you, I have
Are you
never
still there,
seen
Molly?
anything like this. Oh, I'm still here. I've never seen anything like this. And for Senator Orrin Hatch, whose address is his home address, his cell phone, they were released on Wikipedia. The day one of the hearings started. Perhaps from that perspective, that's maybe where he was coming from for saying, for sort of dismissing it. But really, even Bob Corker, who actually engaged with some of these protesters and answered their questions and then was screamed at when he walked outside the airport. There's another man there with a camera kind of shooting him to record this. He said, this is just a totally different thing. And Jeff Flake, yes, that big moment with the protester when he was getting on the elevator, that, ostensibly that's what really turned him. But also he keep in mind the night before on Thursday night he had a private meeting with Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins, and Joe Manchin after that day-long Thursday hearing, and so he knew that his fellow colleagues still had questions. There were questions about Mark Judge. Republicans also wanted to hear more information from Mark Judge and the people who ultimately were interviewed by the FBI in the supplemental investigation. So yes, the protesters are definitely. They are definitely galvanizing people, but it may be having the opposite effect. And this is from Bob Corker, who told me this, who said they may be overplaying their hand. And he was one of the first Republicans to call for a stop to the Kavanaugh nomination until there was a hearing with Dr. Ford. So this isn't coming from a partisan on either side. He legitimately is in the middle. And he said, the protesters may be overplaying their hand because they're just screaming and they're not willing to engage in conversation. So it's quite a time to be on Capitol Hill, is all I could say.
Yeah, that's a great way to sum it up.
Yeah.
I recall the protesters earlier in the week while there was testimony going on. One of the other things they were yelling in the hallway was "November is coming." We're kind of living in a time where it's sort of fires flare up fast and furious, and often it's sort of shocking when you realize that something happened just a week ago because it feels like a month has gone by. Do you think, as we were anticipating, that this nomination, the Kavanaugh nomination, will have an impact come the midterm elections? Or do you think by the time they're voting in November, there'll be 9 other things that we'll be talking about?
I think that, and this is what I'm hearing, this is what Lindsey Graham has been saying publicly everywhere, anywhere, this issue, how Brett Kavanaugh's nomination was handled and the tactics that were employed to attempt to stop it, that actually has galvanized Republicans to coalesce under one party again. I mean, you had the anti-Trumpers, and this is what was most striking to me after the hearing on Thursday, talking to Republican women. And these were women on the House side. So the House doesn't have a vote in all this. But these are Republican women, one of whom was in an anti-Trumper office and is not a big fan of the president, saying that that's it. People are going to go out to vote. Brett Kavanaugh could have been my son. He could have been my father. He could have been my brother. and he wasn't treated fairly, and you ruined this guy's reputation. Not you, but she was saying the Democrats have ruined this guy's reputation. It was not fair. They sat on the information for 45 days, which could be one reason why Joe Manchin may be voting the way he's voting, or could prompt him to vote for Kavanaugh. Judge Ford, why didn't the committee go to California? She said under oath in the committee that it wasn't clear that the committee would go to her. The committee had reached out to her attorneys at least 4 times before a hearing on Thursday was even agreed to, saying that we can come to you, we can do this privately so that you don't have to be all over the news. And so those kind of things, Republicans are paying attention to it. And the scorched earth tactics, it's galvanizing them, not necessarily in favor of Trump, but against what they see as dirty tricks. And you don't know. I mean, who knows if it'll stay? But at the same time, again, I was surprised to hear this from the Republicans I was hearing it from.
It's an interesting
That's
point.
really interesting.
And several Republican strategists have mentioned that to us, including Dan Senor and Fran Townsend, who have said that they, up until this moment, hadn't seen something that had galvanized Republicans, even those who were never Trumpers, around a single issue. The question, though, is, I wonder if that is what is happening, because the narrative, and these are narratives, right? Sometimes these are narratives that exist in the media world that don't really exist in the real world. But if it's because the narrative...
Here's the thing. President Trump is the president, right?
Exactly right. Exactly right. Because the narrative when it comes to Democrats had been they are galvanized and they are angry.
Yes.
You saw 1 million women marching after the inauguration, and those are the people that are going to come out and vote. And, they are taking the lessons of 2014 that President Obama has been hammering over and over again at the speeches that he's given, which is that elections have consequences. And so now people really get it.
And what we might see is what we saw after Justice Thomas, which was sort of a wave of women coming in, right?
Exactly. So is this a way for Republican pollsters and spin doctors to say, no, we're actually also galvanized, much in the same way that the guys on the blue team are?
You want to know something? Honestly, these people had no reason to say that they were fired up like they were. And in fact, I hadn't seen Republicans fired up like this. And keep in mind, the Democrats were already galvanized. They want to get out to vote. They are raring to go. This isn't like we've got to rally you guys to get to the polls. They're doing it. The Republicans are the ones who are kind of sitting back and saying, things are going well. That's who, and not all of them like President Trump. I mean, even members of the House are not big fans. I mean, they have a tough time answering some of these tweets that the president sends out. But again, it wasn't necessarily who Brett Kavanaugh is, or that he's such a great justice. I mean, even we're listening on the Senate floor, we're not hearing about the cases that he's ruled in favor of or against, or the positions he's taken, or the fact that how many times he's been overruled by the Supreme Court. We're not talking about that. We're listening to how he was treated. When somebody accused this man of committing crimes, like committing a felony, and not really being able to prove it per se, or prove it to the people who are going to be voting, and that does galvanize folks who don't want the government to be a part of their life. We're more for limited government and innocent till proven guilty, and that's a big deal. And I realized what a big deal it was when I did talk to the thing that was more fascinating to me was I talked to 3 Republican women who I thought, what are they going to say? And in fact, it was the opposite of what I anticipated to hear. Because again, Lisa Murkowski, she has reasons, reasons against Judge Kavanaugh based on the rulings he's made and the emails he sent in his role as, George W. Bush's personal, secretary, right, back in the Bush years. But regarding the sexual assault, that kind of puts her in a different box because, this is something that innocent till proven guilty. She was a county prosecutor. And it's those folks who get really fired up. But there's a reason Lindsey Graham is so fired up about this. Because, you got to have evidence. You got to have it. And whether it's true or not, it's just like, how does Judge Kavanaugh, if he's not confirmed, how does he go back to the bench? If he's not confirmed because the Senate thinks that he committed the sexual assault, how does he go back to the bench? And, are they going to take actions? Like, if the Democrats take control of the Senate, will the Democrats try to impeach him as a federal judge? That's something I kind of want to find out, because it just shakes up everything that, and especially since Donald Trump, as Caitlin was saying, the judgeships, appointing judges, the Supreme Court, this is the reason why so many Republicans got to the polls and voted for Donald Trump. Evangelicals voted for Donald Trump. And unless you have a galvanizing issue like this, it's hard to get those folks out in the midterms. Ask George W. Bush in 2006. It didn't go so well for him. Yeah. But so anyway, so it's unclear. And unless I had heard these my sources tell me this with their own, unless I had heard them tell me this personally, I'd probably think, the Republican strategist, it's kind of wishful thinking, but I don't know. It'll be.
Yeah, well, we're only a month out, so we'll have to see how it all plays out. Molly, always great to have your insight, your analysis, and your reporting. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We'll talk to you in a bit.
All right, so we're, of course, going to continue to cover this, but we have a lot more news to tell you about, including some breaking news out of Tennessee. The manhunt is over for Kirby Wallace. According to the information we have right now, he has been located alive and he is in custody. He was wanted for 2 murders in Tennessee. He's been on the run for about a week. As soon as we get more information on that, we're going to bring it to you. For now, we're going to take a bit of a break. You're streaming CBSN, CBS News, always on.
Officials say more than 1,000 people may still be missing in